Hi, everyone. This week we are starting our new unit on modernism. And so I wanted to go ahead and go through um, some slides kind of going over some of the main ideas for the week. So basically, when we're looking at modernism, some of the main things to note are basically the attitude of this era is definitely pushing back, right? And I think we saw this a little bit with the Victorian era too, where they are tired of all of this individualism and genius of the Romantic era. And they want something that's more objective, something that's more about, society, working together, working together and how society works and not just how individuals work. Modernism is going to say, okay, now we're tired of the Victorian era and how they're so obsessed with decorum and manners and all of this kind of stuff. So stuffy. And it's important to think about too the kinds of things that were happening, which we'll get to that at this time to kind of create this sort of kind of almost like an anger, right? That I think is really present in a lot of the works that we're going to read during this time period. But if we look at the verbs used in the textbook, rebelled, subverted, breaking up, violating, disrupting, questioning, right? And I'm just taking those directly from the section on modernism, 20th century, right? Yeah, it's just there's a lot of pushing back against the previous era and just kind of culture at large. One of the things that can be tough with modernism, and I remember when I was a student in college and I complained to this about my professor, is this is not necessarily the most accessible literature that we'll read all semester. There's a lot of references, allusions to things that if you don't have an education in classics, like Virginia Woolf, for example, or Yeats, these people had they knew Greek, they had private tutors, and so it's just we're kind of talking the people who are writing in this era that we'll be reading, because they're so prominent, they define the era for purposes of tests and things. They're really highly educated, right? And so sometimes it does feel inaccessible. The other thing about this is, it's very intellectual too. They're working with a lot of ideas about psychology and trying to figure out how the mind works. The other thing that's kind of difficult about this era is that it's pretty experimental. And also, so that can be a little bit frustrating as a reader because they're not necessarily going to present things to you in a way that is very concerned about you understanding it, right? It's more trying to challenge your expectations. And so not everything is going to be that way, right? And again, we're thinking more of the people who define this era, but it's kind of known for being very brash, very, difficult intentionally. And so when we think about the historical context, right, I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that World War I happened, right? And nothing like that had really happened before in Europe, or really honestly in the world, to this kind of level where there were all of these ally ships and between different countries, and they all had to work. They all had to kind of jump into this war because of the way that they were all called on to be a part of it. And it just really affected our literature from this era, right? We're going to see a lot of violence. We're going to see, I think, even the hostility towards the reader kind of reflects this trauma that people were experiencing. At the same time, we're also going to see, and I mean, we'll see literally in Mrs. Dalloway, there's references to things that, referencing wartime things. We're also going to see Irish Rebellion, Irish Anglo War, Russian Revolution. And so there's the revolution continues, right? That we've been looking at all these different revolutions, but we're really starting to see overthrowing monarchy, getting rid of empires. That's going to be even more pronounced after World War II. And then speaking of World War II, it's a little bit controversial to put dates on modernism because sometimes people really think it's it's more narrow, and some people think it's, you know, wider. It's difficult, but you know, probably the most influential moment or event of modernist history is going to be the World War I. And then we're going to go ahead and say World War II. The end of World War II is where we're gonna stop talking about modernism. Okay. And again, it maybe is oversimplifying, but I think for our purposes that will be helpful. And honestly, that's the way we tend to talk about them on tests too. So let's get into Yeats. So Yeats is an interesting poet, another Irish poet, right? 1865 to 1939. He is born in Dublin to Protestants, meaning these are people who, an Irish minority who sympathize with British rule. They like, you know, kind of the being part of that empire, the British Empire. Um, However, Yeats is not into that. He does not want, he's not into England ruling. I mean, he's not as opposed to it as maybe other, you know, some Irish nationalists like the one he falls in love with. But he's very into Irish culture. He's for Ireland, okay. And he does move to England for a while with his family, and while he's there, he co-founds this thing called the Rhymers Club. Um, but but he ends up moving back to Ireland, and part of this is because of Maud Gunn. She tells him, you know, kind of that it's best for Ireland, right? If people go back there and build the culture there, and so he does this after Easter Rising, which is, you know, kind of this uprising in Ireland against, you know, British rule and things like that. And then we're going to see the Irish Anglo War begin in 1919, I think. And we'll talk about that in a minute. One of the things about Yeats that's really important, especially for the poems that we're going to be reading, because look, Yeats wrote a lot. He wrote a lot, and not just poetry, he also wrote drama. And also, he is one of the things he's the most famous for is that he changed so much. So, like, if he kind of got tired of a certain type of poetry, then he would write a different type. um, and, you know, I think if you really like his style, like if you kind of like the way he uses words and things, then you might want to check out some of his other poems that are less famous, but still, I mean, kind of incredible. Like he does, what's the poem called? The Changeling or the Stolen Child or something like that. He does some stuff with like Irish folklore that is cool if you're into folklore, and especially earlier in his career. But he's eventually going to get into this gyre stuff, right? And so, you know, gyre is like a spiral whirl. And it's for him kind of this metaphysical concept about, and I'll get into this in a second. Let me wait till the next slide. But he's really into the occult. He's part of this group called the Golden Dawn, which we would now probably refer, I mean, I think is probably referred to as a cult. There's rituals and things like that. And lots of famous people are in it, like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Maybe worth checking out if you're interested in things like that. But he's really into metaphysical, you know, kind of spiritual, philosophical kinds of things, and practices. And by the way, he won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1923. So he was really appreciated during his lifetime. He wasn't, you know, he was not living in obscurity. And this is him, by the way, with the glasses. He has a lot of, you know, personality. There's a lot of photographs of him. I think just because he's interesting to look at, and he's really famous. And then that's his wife in the like the dark hat with the ribbon, Georgie or George. And so kind of going on about Yeats's mysticism here. So Georgie practiced this thing called automatic writing and ended up writing like 4,000 of these texts where they would sit down, or 4,000 pages, I think, of these texts. And so I have a quote here from Poetry Foundation, in which her hand and pen presumably served as unconscious instruments for the spirit world to send information. And so this is a time period with a lot of mysticism, you know, seances and things like that were happening. And also a lot of obsession with kind of unconscious, right? We have Freud, we have a lot of kind of theorizing about what is going on in our minds, that people I don't think were as concerned about before. Or if they did, maybe we saw some of this with the Romantics, but they were thinking about the way that the poetic genius could be sort of a catalyst for, I don't know, art experience, connection with nature, connection with God. And this is something a little different, I think, just because it's almost like scientific in the way that it's practiced, right? There's kind of this like very scientific, pseudoscientific approach to how we're going to connect with this realm or this knowledge. Okay. The gyres. Okay. So so basically, what Yeats believed is that certain patterns existed. And I don't want to paraphrase because it's kind of complicated, but basically we have something kind of akin to what Keats was talking about actually, and Yeats did admire Keats, by the way, with these kind of dynamic opposition ideas, right? And the way that those play together. But the thing here is that I think again, it's maybe a little more scientific for Yeats. It's still kind of in the same vein, but he's talking about these ideas kind of swirling around each other and these oppositions, right? This kind of creating a pole, creating a energy. And then he says every 2000 years, in the middle of those 2000-year periods, there's going to be some sort of like intense moment of human change, right? So or moments of balance, right? And so he talks about the Immaculate Conception of Mary, right? He talks about the rape of Leda by Zeus. Um, and basically what he's saying here is that these are moments when a civilization can rise up and become like some great civilization. And so I don't know, there's a lot of interesting thought going on here. Mysticism, patterns, almost a scientific type, relationship to time and mysticism, which again, like time is kind of not a new concept by any means, but something that I think people are starting to think about a little bit differently since industrialization is just taking such hold. Um, and so somewhat new, even if it doesn't feel like it. And so yes, we have all of these great civilizations that he's referring to. It's interesting, I think, the way that he's talking about these things. I think that he's Irish and he's part of this great British Empire, which I think he's seeing as potentially a great civilization, right? I'm curious kind of what he thinks about this. And I think, it's interesting to look at what he says about, what he has to say. And I think he's speaking a lot through his poetry. So we have The Second Coming. This is one of the most famous poems of this time period and of him for sure. It's written in 1919, just after World War I, the Easter Rising, and the Russian Revolution. It's written the month that the Irish-Anglo War begins. Okay, so January of 1919. And then it's written during the influenza pandemic, right? So this is the flu pandemic. And his wife, Georgie, actually was pregnant. And I think the death rate of pregnant women at the time, I think I might have read this on Wikipedia, so a grain of salt, was 70%. But it's like, it's similar to with COVID, how people are just so much more susceptible to death with some of these illnesses. And so Georgie had this while she was pregnant and was recovering when he wrote the poem. So we can see just like a probably terrible time for him, right? Anyway, so he's going to make references to the birth of Jesus, the apocalypse, second coming. I mean, he's using a lot of imagery that feels very evocative of apocalypse, Christian narratives. And then of course he is also going to be talking about, his gyres, right? This is one of the most quoted reference poems ever. You might have noticed that when you're reading along, there's so many lines that are references, that are referred to in other works. And I have a list linked here if you want to see that. One of the other things that's interesting about Yeats and that we can see in this poem is that he kind of goes through periods where he really sticks to like form. He's like very dedicated to form and playing with form. is an important part of his poems. This is one that is kind of harder to categorize. It is written in a rough iambic pentameter. But I've read it described as almost free verse. It's not as easy to pin down as some of his other works. Um, let's go ahead and talk about Leda and the Swan. So this is a sonnet. And what it's doing is talking about this story from Greek mythology about when god Zeus, he rapes Leda, who's the Spartan queen, and later she ends up laying eggs, and from those eggs are born Helen of Troy, Clytemnestra, who is an important queen who ends up killing her husband Agamemnon. Um, and then Castor and Pollux, who are, all of these people are like figures who appear in Greek mythology, and some of them very, very important figures, right? Um, but all of them kind of attached to violence, and especially Clytemnestra and Helen, right? And so, one of the things that Yeats tells us is that he believes that this is the kind of pivotal moment of the Greek civilization kind of rising, right? Is when Zeus rapes Leda, and she gives birth to kind of this Greek civilization or whatever. Anyway, um, but one of the things that we can tell by the way that he's written this poem that's very graphic, feel it's very violent in its language, and not to mention the way that he's kind of like making allusions to later violence with the Trojan War and with Clytemnestra killing Agamemnon, is that we can see that he believes that because this was such a violent act, right, this rape, that it's kind of like that violence has echoed into Greek culture, right? And it's affected the Greeks in this negative way. Um, Okay, Sailing to Byzantium. This is another aging poem, right? It's weird to compare it to Tintern Abbey, maybe, because this is more of a middle-aged poem. Probably an easier example would be Ulysses, right? The one that we read more recently. But these poets writing about aging. This is another one of them. Um, and uh, Going back to form, so the last poem we were talking about is a sonnet. This one's an ottava rima structure, which just means that there's these 8-line stanzas. There's 4 8-line stanzas, and each of the lines has, and I'm blinking, I can't remember if they did 10 or 11. That's an option because later English poets are going to start using 10 syllable lines. Originally 11 syllable lines in the Italian form, and then the rhyme structure is going to be A B A B. Wait, A, B, A, B, A, B, C, C. So you got a little couplet there, a C's at the end. And notably, it's most often used with epic kinds of writing. And this is not epic, right? He's talking about a lot of great, grand ideas and things like that, Byzantium. However, this is not really an epic, right? It's more about like an individual aging and kind of this resistance to thinking of yourself as being attached to an aging body, and instead thinking of how your soul is eternal and how you want your soul to, be able to continue to thrive after your body doesn't. Um, and so again, we're coming back to this mysticism, right? He talks about his heart being fastened to a dying animal. He references William Blake's description of his dying brother clapping his hands for joy as he's like, floating in the sky towards heaven. So there's a lot going on here. This is a poem that is interpreted a lot. It's kind of dense. Not my favorite Yeats, I'm not gonna lie, although it's really beautiful. And there are a lot of again, a lot of references and lines in here that end up becoming part of our culture. And then later he's going to write Byzantium too. So, there's kind of a companion poem to this if you're interested. But it's really interpreted a lot because of how dense it is. There's so much to analyze. I think the main ideas that we need from here are form and kind of the overall theme of aging. Okay, and maybe thinking of that in comparison with other aging poems. Okay, we're going to move on now to Virginia Woolf, another one of the, people defining this time period. Virginia Woolf, 1882 to 1941, somewhat short life. She had a pretty, kind of, like Yeats, kind of a great education. I'm trying, what is the word? She had like a nice upbringing in some ways. She got to really hobnob with some of the biggest writers, Henry James and Thomas Hardy, which is wow, like that would be a big deal to grow up with those people. Um, William Pater's sister tutored her in Greek, so she has all of these opportunities. She's connected to so many people because her dad is running some magazines, publications. And unfortunately, though, her life is also extremely difficult. She's sexually abused by her half brothers. Um, she experiences the loss of her mom, her half sister, her brother, and her dad, like in pretty close succession. So she, yeah, it doesn't end up going as easy as maybe it could have, considering, that she did have a pretty, I cannot think of another word besides blessed, and that is not what I mean. But you know what I mean, a lot of privilege. There we go, privileged life. Um, so then after her dad dies, she moves with her brothers and sister, not the same brothers who abused her, by the way, to Bloomsbury in London. And if you've been to Bloomsbury, it's like a cultural center. That's where the British Museum is. It's a very, there's a lot of culture there. You could see why there would be something called the Bloomsbury Group that forms and meets in Bloomsbury. A lot of artists live in that area or did, at that time. And one thing to note about the Bloomsbury group too, because if one of the things that I think is talked about more these days is that Virginia Woolf was queer, right? This is a group that's almost entirely made up of people who are gay or like bisexual, queer, not straight people, for the most part. And she would have, she's married to a man, but she's pretty open about the fact that in her letters and things, that she's not really attracted to men, and she ends up having lots of relationships with women, one in particular who is kind of considered like her great love, right? Even though she has a good relationship with her husband, and they actually like work together, make a publication, or a press, I mean, and have a great friendship, but it doesn't seem like super romantic, right? Um, so a lot of things, another thing to probably note about her, like I said, her queerness, but she's also really noted for her feminism, right? She wrote A Room of One's Own. We talked about the way that she has kind of made Coventry Patmore relevant again by talking about the angel in the house as being like this terrible ideal that has limited her so much and other women, to make them like not able to be creative or really have agency. And so we can look at how all of these events in her life, and her own, sexual identity kind of have probably contributed to her feminism, right? And I think we can see that reflected in her works for sure. So she did suffer from severe depression, depressive episodes. And I think like the thing that makes me the saddest about this is that the depression tended to come on when she finished a novel. So the writing seemed to be just like so energizing and fulfilling and important to her. And finishing, it must have just been very anticlimactic, and kind of devastating to be done with the project like that. And so it ended up kind of bringing on these horrible depressive episodes. And anyway, and I mean, I do wonder too. I mean, we know more about psychology now, and the people that I know, it does make me wonder about how this might have been treated now in a better way. Now that we understand things like bipolar disorder, for example, better. But she did die by suicide in 1941. And I've always read prior to recently when I was researching her again for class, that this was just she's depressed, and she kind of felt hopeless, um and kind of trapped in her marriage and things like that. And that is not what I read this time. It said that she was scared the Nazis were going to invade England. She was an intellectual, her husband was Jewish, so there were lots of reasons why they might have she and her husband might have been captured by Nazis had they invaded. And also, she was really worried that she was about to go into another depressive episode, maybe even permanently, right? And if you've dealt with things like mental health, it doesn't necessarily, you're not necessarily in the state of mind to think, well, this will, it won't be forever. And so she was worried her husband would have to take care of her for the rest of her life. And so she's kind of saw this as like doing good for him as well. So just a terrible thing. And it's I wish that she could have lived longer because she was just such a prolific and important writer. Um, okay. So A Room of One's Own, this is one of the most important texts that we're going to probably talk about. It's really influential. And so this is an essay that comes from two lectures that she gave at Cambridge to female students on the topic of women in fiction. And if you, I don't know how much of this you read, but she is really poring over this history, these history textbooks in this essay, and just kind of finding herself coming up short again and again, very frustrated to not see women represented, and to see people dismissing women because they haven't written great works. And kind of this idea that maybe women haven't written great works because women just really don't have the capability. And she thought, that doesn't really ring true for her, right? And so she ends up writing this really famous, often cited, and by the way, often tested on. So good to know if you're planning on taking any, more classes or tests in English. Um, in English Lit. So this section called Shakespeare's Sister, right? Judith Shakespeare. And the idea here is that it's not that women don't have natural ability or aren't capable of writing great literature. It's that the world that they live in prevents them from being able to create, right? And to be artists. And so yeah. This is one of the most famous lines, and just one of my favorite lines from Woolf. She says, to explain kind of the slack. She says, when, however, one reads of a witch being ducked, of a woman possessed by devils, of a wise woman selling herbs, or even a very remarkable man who had a mother, then I think we are on the track of a lost novelist, a suppressed poet, of some mute and inglorious Jane Austen, some Emily Bronte who dashed her brains out on the moor, or mopped and mowed about the highways crazed with the torture that her gift had put her to. And so it's just like, I think especially knowing how much Virginia Woolf suffered, hard to read about these tormented women. But yeah, she's saying, women just could not have been doing this at that time. And in fact, if they had tried, they probably would have lost their minds. Or even if they hadn't tried, if they had this great ability that we see in some of the men of that era, they might not have been able to survive it because it would have been maddening to not be able to use that energy. Okay, Mrs. Dalloway, and by the way, I am including a picture here of the Hours poster because this is Virginia Woolf. Well, it's Nicole Kidman pretending to be Virginia Woolf, right? And then this is Mrs. Dalloway, Meryl Streep playing Mrs. Dalloway, right? So if you haven't seen this movie, it might be one to check out. Just it's a very interesting study of Virginia Woolf and her writing, and her themes. Okay, so why did I have you read this? Mrs. Dalloway is not, this is actually one of her more approachable books. She is a difficult writer of fiction, I think, to read. Um, if you liked this, oh, you should really read her work because she is going to do more of this. This is, I think, a good example of her work that is, again, more accessible. Some of her work is like The Waves is really difficult to read and understand. And part of the reason that that's true is because she's using this technique, and she is really the person who we most attribute this tech, and James Joyce, and we'll talk about him next week, okay? But she's really defining this technique in the culture, stream of consciousness. Okay, she really perfects this, and I think a way that is a little bit more accessible than Joyce sometimes. But anyway, so what we're trying to do with stream of consciousness then is capture all of the things that are happening, right? So in a person's mind, so all of the stimuli that are coming in, she's hearing things, she's seeing things, she smells the flowers, she's thinking, oh, she's remembering, oh, I need to buy flowers. She's, it's like all of these things are happening and there's not really a logic to them, right? There's not a logical order. The writer, and this is one of the things that we talked about with modernism, right? The writer is not necessarily concerned with making this, approachable or easy to understand for us. This is more about a concept, experimentation, exploration. And so it can be kind of frustrating to read and difficult. But I think if you just kind of let go and just kind of let it pour over you, and that might be the best approach. Don't be looking for meaning if you can help it, because it really is about an experience that they're trying to capture, right? And so this is going to be about stream of consciousness. If we think about this, this is a good example of a psychological novel, right? Where the plot is secondary to what's going on in a character's mind. And so we'll see this again with James Joyce too, the way that the plot is so wrapped up in the character's mind that even something like remembering something, right, is going to be the climax of a story, right? This is so influential. One of the things that this really does is it really brings up more possibilities of nonlinear narratives because of things like flashbacks. It's really breaking apart structure, right? We expect to be introduced to a character, a description of that character. We expect to learn where they are by hearing these little details, but then we move into plot pretty quickly so that we don't get bored. And she's just not going to do that for us, right? We are going to get all of these details, all of this information, all of the stimuli coming in, and we're just going to have to figure out what to do with it. And one of the ideas of this time period, and we'll talk more about this, is that readers are they have a role to play, right? The author, it's not all on the author to, and this will be more of postmodernism, by the way, but it's not all on the author to create meaning. The reader is bringing their own knowledge and experience to the work, and through that kind of that meshing together, right? Through the experience of reading the text that the author created, that's how we create meaning. All right, I think that's everything. I know it's a lot, but I hope you have a great week, and we're gonna get through this because I know it can be a little challenging, but I think as long as we keep in mind it's supposed to be, we'll do it. We'll do great. All right, have a great week.